One observation that was really interesting to me about Nassim Nicholas Taleb's book Anti-Fragile, which I'm going to talk about this one more in the future, but he talked about it's often a really good sign you should read a book if you see a lot of people who are criticizing it, but their criticism is incoherent, like on the face, it's bad criticism, or they're all saying different things, because this means that the book is impactful enough they had a reaction, but they can't explain why it's wrong. And having that reaction doesn't mean the book is necessarily going to be right, but it does mean it's at least working into to try to evaluate for yourself, is this actually something I can respond to? Does it challenge how I think about things? And so I have 3 books I want to talk about because 2 of them I read, 1 of them I bought, but I only read the introduction and maybe first chapter, because they were reviewed on YouTube channels that at least 2 of them were people I found like reasonably reliable in terms of what they were saying, and I sort of trusted them to a default level at the time, but they were bad criticisms. The third one might have been also, but I don't remember exactly. And I'm going to talk about these books and what the criticism was and why I read them based on the bad criticism. So the first of these is The Anxious Generation by Johnathan Haidt. I mentioned this one in my agency and communion video. That's where I learned that term as and the concept that these are the 2 fundamental human social motivations. And I've read Haidt's first 2 books, which are The Happiness Hypothesis and The Righteous Mind. And I want to talk about both of those at some point, especially The Righteous Mind. His third book, it sounded like, yeah, I kind of agree with this, but also it doesn't seem like a big issue to me, like it's not a priority. And so I didn't even bother reading it. That was The Coddling of the American Mind, where he was arguing that colleges aren't challenging students enough. And I think that's probably true, but it still doesn't seem like a big, like, of the things I'm concerned about, that is low on my priority list. And so then I saw a YouTuber who I trusted at the time who was basically just reading a review that tore this book apart. And she really didn't like Haidt because of that third book I mentioned, Coddling the American Mind, and what it said. And the review, I don't remember the details, but I remember thinking, this is a really bad review. I can tell just from this review that this is a combination of not an accurate representation of what the book will be, and not really a valid criticism of what, by their own account, the book is saying. So I was like, I should get this book, and I should actually read it. And this one had not really seemed priority to me, because it's about Gen Z, and I'm a millennial. But reading it, I was like, oh wow, actually, like, he spoke specifically on Gen Z. They've had the worst of it, but I can relate to like a lot of the impact of this. And I actually, as a result of reading this book, I had a book by Newport, Digital Minimalism, that I had bought and meant to read, and then the introduction was so painful for me. Didn't want to admit that I had kind of a screen addiction, that I'm like, no, I can't do this. I'll do it some other time. And I'm like, no, I think that Haidt is right here, and he's right even for my generation that didn't have these things growing up to the same degree. And I want to try to basically do a digital detox. So I read Digital Minimalism. That was either the 4th or the 1st Cal Newport book I read, and I forget which. But either I read 3 of them and was amazed, and then still didn't read that one until I read this one, The Anxious Generation by Haidt, or it was the first one, and that got me reading the rest of Cal Newport. I don't remember at this point. And that has helped me get my life in order a lot more by doing that. And I'm not as consistent about it as I should be, but it has still helped a lot. And so one thing about this book, the criticism, as I remember, is that it was focused on saying that his prescriptions were bad, his suggestions, and I'm like, well, that's the thing about a lot of books, is they often have suggestions that are, I would disagree with, I would think they are bad, because we culturally have this attitude, don't criticize something until you have an answer, but a bad answer is worse than admitting you don't know the answer at all, and the first step to solving a problem is diagnosing it well. And I think I was thinking, the description, this diagnosis sounds credible. So I read it, and I think it was worth reading. I am agnostic on whether the claims about Gen Z, I lean towards probably yes, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is I'm realizing as a millennial, a lot of this was relevant to me, and it finally got me reading Digital Minimalism and trying to have a lot less screen time in my life. And then the next book on the list is the only one of these 3 that I haven't read yet, which is The Clash of Civilizations by Samuel Huntingdon. And I have a video that I finished up on YouTube that I didn't publish, because if it gets traction, it's going to be contentious, defending Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel more in the way that I do it, because I'm not engaging with them on the arguments they want me to engage. I'm saying, no, the assumptions you're making in these arguments against Guns, Germs, and Steel are flawed to begin with, and it's an issue in academic history. But anyways, while I was doing that video, a YouTuber that I watch sometimes, he did a community post where he asked, so Samuel Huntingdon predicted that Russia and Ukraine could never go to war because it would destroy Russia to do. And so should I mention that context in my book review? And of course, all the comments are saying, yes, this is important. His prediction that Russia going to war with Ukraine would destroy Russia, the jury's out, but it seems to be in that direction. What he was wrong about was his assumption that Russian policymakers would recognize this and not make a mistake there. So I read the first introduction, I think the first chapter of this, and I'm like, okay, this is a political science book that is not really helpful to what I'm trying to do right now, so I'm putting it on pause, but I bought it and I will probably read it at some point. And this is a book that I've known like it's been controversial for a long time, so when I read it, I'll see what I think about it. But certainly he seems a lot more reasonable in the introduction and first chapter than the people who I grew up like hearing criticizing it presented him as. And then this last one, which I have now, it should be up by the time this video is out on my Substack, a post on this. I call it the best worst self-help book that I have ever read, because it is really badly written. This is a book that could be really less than 10% of what it is, and most of it is explaining how he got to this. And I feel like it's basically he wrote it this way so he could have a book to sell the test, which is $20. So the hardcover book was like $10 or less, and then the actual test to see where you are on this was like $20. And then he also sells business consulting, and so I think it's basically a long ad for that. I think the sort of central point that I'm taking away from this book, he's right about sort of two things, which are there's basically people who are good at seeing the forest and not looking at the trees on one hand, people who are really good at like looking at all the trees individually and measuring them in a consistent way. And then you have the people who sort of help coordinate between the two. And this is something I've seen come up again and again across different writers. And then he also has another distinction between agency and communion, which is why I talked about it in that video. But the reason I read this book, I had never even heard of this book before until there was a YouTube video that I think is by someone I watch and trust, but this is the one I'm not sure about. But it was basically saying self-help has an agenda, which is, it's a Mormon agenda. Like most of the best known self-help books, or a big proportion of them, are Mormon. 7 Habits of Highly Effective People was written by a Mormon. Greg McKeown, Essentialism, which I talked about in my self-help book video, is written by a Mormon. And I did not find it compelling that I'm like, okay, but I've read 7 Habits already, and even if it's Mormon, it's general enough to be useful. Like, this is not going to convert me to Mormonism. Like, even if, yes, it's going to make me live more in the way Mormons might want, it's only if it's, like, useful to me. And Essentialism, I don't even know if that fits with, like, anything I know about Mormonism, and I'm not an expert in Mormonism. And so I'm like, this is not compelling. And he, as I recall, mentioned this in passing. It wasn't very compelling, but I'm like, I never heard of this. It sounds interesting. I read it. This is one of those self-help books that I read really fast. The only thing that slowed me down a bit, like, I probably would have read it in an hour, except that it was all in first person with a very, he gave the narrator a lot of personality that made it hard to read. So I think it took me like an hour and a half on this one. So it's like, and again, really, I think you could boil this down to, like, I could probably explain this book in under 10 minutes and get everything that is important about it in a video. And that's my main criticism. I feel like it's padded to sell the test and the course. But this was a useful video because it helped me sort of identify and crystallize the connection between the high level, so the people who can see the forest, which is where my skills really are, the people who can measure each tree in the forest, like, individually and consistently, which I've had to learn a little bit to do in corporate, but it is not my strength, and then the people who are sort of in between those, and the agency communion distinction. And so that, and then some of the other things too. So yeah, these are 3 books that I found, again, haven't read one of them, but I bought it because of someone asking, should I present what he said in kind of bad faith? Like, asking his audience that. This one I read because the review that a YouTuber I, at the time at least, somewhat trusted, well, she was reading it, she didn't write it, but I'm like, she thought it was valid. She didn't like Haidt, and I'm like, it sounds like it's missing the point and focusing. And so I read it, and I was like, yeah, that review was missing the point. And I'm going to see if I can find these videos. If it's not too much trouble, I'll link them. If it is, I won't bother, because I'm trying to do this channel faster. And then this last one, again, was really interesting in the central ideas, tied a lot of stuff together, really badly written, and sort of, I think, trying to sell his course, well, his test in his course, but I'm still glad I read it. And so I feel like that is, based on my experience, this is a useful metric that Taleb presented, which is look at like the criticisms. Are they coming from people you would consider credible, and yet, or they should be credible, and yet they are bad criticisms, or they are like inconsistent with each other? Or in this case, they were bad criticisms of a different book that I had already read, and I'm like, I should check out this other one that he's criticizing as well. But anyways, that's it for today. I'm Magpie, thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one.